I love all currently five, books of the A Song of Ice and Fire series, but with that said, that love is not necessarily equal. There are some that I like more, some that I like less, and today I'm going to go through those five books and order them from my least favorite to my favorite. With that said, my least favorite on this list is still among my favorite books ever, and I would happily reread it at any point. It's just how I rank these individual novels as related to one another. So I do think it's quite interesting to kind of track the development of the series and just see how much I like each book, as opinions are quite flexible and change quite a bit. I know that my opinions are different now than they were when I started talking about A Song of Ice and Fire on this channel about 2 years ago. So I figured it'd be good to go through and discuss each book, why I like it, elements of it I don't like, and yeah, I thought it'd be nice to rank them in comparison to one another. It is worth noting that I will not be ranking other A Song of Ice and Fire adjacent material. I won't be ranking the three Duncan Egg short stories, Fire and Blood, or the World Book. I could throw those in an additional video, but it is worth noting that I'd rank all of them below these core five books, despite some arguments that Duncan Egg stories are stronger per word than A Song of Ice and Fire. I think that just the sheer amount of good material in Ice and Fire that really just lifts any book of that series above the shorter novellas. Without further ado, let's get to ranking. In fifth place, in my view, the weakest of the A Song of Ice and Fire core series is A Clash of Kings. Clash is by no means a bad book, I just think it's a little bit more mixed than all of the others in the series. I count it as kind of the first proper A Song of Ice and Fire novel. I'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about the first book, but it is the kind of first entry into this more expansive world that we're seeing. Chapters are getting longer, and the story in itself is less kind of self-contained, less of a neat narrative, and more just kind of sprawling and all-encompassing. I think a weakness of this book is that there are quite a few individual storylines that I'm just not the biggest fan of overall. I think John's story is probably at its weakest in this book, with the ranging north of the wall really not being super duper eventful until the end with his mini voyage with Corin Halfhand. I think Daenerys' story is by far at its weakest here. Karth is just kind of boring. The House of the Undying is an excellent payoff for her story as a whole, but it takes quite a while to get there, and I don't know, it's not quite as consistently good as her stories in A Storm of Swords or Game of Thrones, and I don't think it's as thematically rich as her story in A Dance with Dragons. Arya is also on the weaker side in this book, I view. Her just kind of stumbling around the Riverlands and being a prisoner of war, while thematically significant for the book, just isn't really great on reread. With that said, there's still a lot of Clash that I absolutely love. All of the War of the Five Kings stuff is incredible here. Kat's perspective in particular is quite the standout. I really enjoy her dynamic, not only with Robb, but getting to see the Renly and Stannis camps and actually witnessing Renly's death. There are also a number of characters introduced in this book that are all-timers for the series. Brienne, Stannis, Davos, all these people. And additionally, I think Tyrion's chapters in King's Landing are absolutely worth mentioning. I think with these longer books, it's strange to have a character have 15 chapters. I think this is maybe a little much, but given that some of these chapters are shortened for the Blackwater, I am A-okay with it, because I think Tyrion's story here is pretty great if it maybe could be a chapter shorter or two. Coming in fourth is A Game of Thrones, which is an interesting book for me. I mentioned before that I think Clash is the first real A Song of Ice and Fire novel, and that's because I think that Game of Thrones, A Game of Thrones, not the TV show, is so much different in terms of structure from the rest of the series. The rest of the series, the word I used before when describing Clash, and I would use again, is sprawling. All of these narratives are expanding rapidly beyond their kind of established bounds. We're meeting a number of new characters, introducing tertiary plot lines, all of these things. But A Game of Thrones in itself is a very focused narrative. It's, I think, the best self-contained story out of these four books. However, I do think that it is a little bit in an awkward phase, given that it's the first of this larger saga that wasn't intended to be this large. There are some inconsistencies with the rest of the books, and I do think I prefer the chapter style from the later books. A Game of Thrones chapters are much shorter than those in the later books, and I do think that the later ones give us a bit more insight insight into each character as we spend a bit more time in their shoes. With that said, I still quite like A Game of Thrones. I think that Ned's perspective is one of the best in the entire series. I wish we had it for longer, but it is so effective just being these 15 chapters in the first book. I think Daenerys' chapters are also excellent, and I love that she gets exactly 10, and they sort of kind of dot the book almost perfectly evenly to just keep us alongside her through the very separated journey there. I think that there also are some characters who really don't have a ton to do. Sansa, in particular, doesn't feel like the most necessary addition to this book. She honestly could have been added as Viewpoint in Clash, and I would have been cool with it. But yeah, overall, A Game of Thrones is a very good book. I just don't think it quite measures up to its younger brothers in certain regards. Before we get into the top three, I want to hear your ranking in the comments below. While you're down there, leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel, and it's all free, and it's just great to hear your opinions because I know they'll be different than mine. I also have to say, before going into the top three, that they are incredibly close. These three have switched spots more times than I can count, and honestly, they probably will by the time this video goes live, but I'm going to stick with what I have. I'm going to stick with my gut and how I rank these books, even if it might not be how you rank them. Number three is a big downgrade from what I once ranked it, but I still love this book, and I'm going to explain why it's fallen a little bit in my eyes. A Feast for Crows is my third favorite book in the A Song of Ice and Fire series. I think it shares a lot of DNA with A Dance with Dragons, but with certain flaws and certain strengths that go beyond that book. When we're looking at strengths, I think it's a lot more thematically concise than A Dance with Dragons. It all revolves around the horrors of war and what the aftermath of that does to individuals and societies. I really enjoy that. I do think there are some issues in Feast, though. I think when comparing it to A Dance with Dragons, there are far fewer like standout banger chapters, which there are a lot of in Dance, especially in the last third. Uh, but overall, I think A Feast for Crows has a few pacing issues. I think that it's really cool to have a book where our three quote unquote main viewpoint characters aren't there. But there's also an issue of really not feeling like other characters have a ton to do. Sansa's story in particular really doesn't feel like Martin really had a lot in mind for her during this era. She obviously was supposed to be someone who was going to benefit from the 5-year gap, but only having 3 chapters and only having one memorable scene, at least for me, in those 3 chapters with the meeting with the Lord's Declarant is pretty strange for a character who's so central. Arya is kind of in the same boat. She only has 3 chapters and really not a ton happens. She only has 2 chapters in Dance, and I would argue that more happens in those. However, there are still quite a few strengths to A Feast for Crows. Cersei's chapters are among my favorites in the entire series. Jaime's are also great, as are Brienne's, and I do think that the way those 3 end up kind of ping-ponging as the main viewpoints of this book are quite fun. I really enjoy that. And I do think they complement each other quite well. With that said, a lot of people don't like this one on their first read, given that Brienne's story is quite slow and it takes a read or two to really kind of begin to impact someone, at least typically from what I've seen. There are some flaws to A Feast for Crows. I've been softer on it in the past, and I'm sure I'll get back to there in the future, but overall, it is an excellent book with a few flaws holding it back. Number 2, the big one, A Storm of Swords. Storm is a very action-packed book. It is perhaps the most dense in the entire series in terms of events happening, and to an extent, I feel like that might be a little bit to its detriment. It's strange insofar as, like, the first half-ish of Storm is, like, kind of just a continuation of Clash of Kings. I think it's better than Clash of Kings. I think the 2 new viewpoints, Samwell and Jaime, really add to it quite a bit. Jaime especially. Samwell, I'm not huge on in terms of his like inner voice for chapters, but he keeps seeing cool shit, especially with the others. So his chapters are still fantastic. However, the second half of the Storm of Swords, oh my god, so much happens. We get the Red Wedding, we get the Purple Wedding, we get the attack on Castle Black, we get the death of Lysa Arryn, we get Tyrion's trial, we get the Mountain and the Viper, we get Tyrion's killing of Tywin. Oh my god, there is a ton there. I like the show's decision to split this up over 2 seasons because I think it does allow certain events a lot more time to breathe. And I do think it's interesting how Martin ends up pacing it. We end up getting around the 2/3 mark, we get a ton of Tyrion and King's Landing, and then around the very end of the book, we get a lot of Castle Black with Jon's election to Lord Commander, and then we eventually end off on Lysa's death with Sansa's perspective. The epilogue as well is fantastic. overall, it's just a great book. I love it. It is definitely dense, as I said, so it's a lot to get through. I know Martin had trouble writing it, especially the Red Wedding, because oh my god, what a fantastically written chapter, but oh my god, I can't imagine writing that and thinking how angry people would be at me. But overall, I think A Storm of Swords is kind of the popular choice. It's very often considered to be the best in the A Song of Ice and Fire series. I can absolutely see why that is. I think that as an individual text working together as an individual narrative, it is far and away the best. But I do think that there is one other book in the series that might have a bit higher highs, for me at least. A Dance with Dragons is a really weird book. It's my first choice for best in the Song of Ice and Fire series, and I think that's kind of a rare take. I'm not sure on that. I think A Dance with Dragons is very strange. People have a lot of opinions on this one, especially given the fact that there are characters who are back after a one book absence, and some of those character stories are not great in the eyes of many. Daenerys is the big one that many people jump to. Many people don't like her Marine story. I can understand parts of that. She definitely has a few chapters that are on the weaker side, but in terms of character building and just thematic work in the series in general, Daenerys' struggles with peace and eventual embracing of her Targaryen identity is one of my favorite character arcs in an individual book in this entire series. Additionally, I think Jon's story at the Wall is fantastic. Tyrion's too. I mean, I really like the first half and really don't like the second half, but I do think that's a pretty decent way to balance the book because I do like the second half of A Dance with Dragons a lot more than I like the first half. A Dance with Dragons, I think, is better than A Storm of Swords for a number of reasons, and one of those is that each individual chapter, I think, is higher quality than the average individual chapter from A Storm of Swords. I think that, especially when we get to the last third of A Dance with Dragons, it's just incredible chapter after incredible chapter after incredible chapter. It does not slow down, and honestly, the only way this book could be improved is giving us one of the four battles at its very end. Overall, I think A Dance with Dragons has a fair few flaws. Notably, there are some slow points in the earlier part. I think that there is maybe a little bit too much focus on these three core characters when there are other characters who have a number of interesting chapters, so I kind of want to see more of. But I think just reading it and wanting to reread it, I think A Dance with Dragons is far and away the most in the entire series, not just because it's the most recent, but because each individual chapter is just fantastic in and of itself. I love the structure of each of them, and I'd say if I were to make like my favorite 10 favorite chapters from the entire series, I would guess that around 6 or 7 would be from A Dance with Dragons. It's a fantastic book, and I love every time I reread it. I also just read The Winds of Winter, and I think I'll place it at about third place. So just fair warning for when you all do. I know I'm a little ahead of time, but I've been having the dreams again, and they're speaking to me. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the books in the comments below. I have much more coming in the very near future. I've recently finished recording my biggest video ever. I've also recently started editing that. It is a behemoth, and I look forward to hopefully sharing it with you all very soon. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you in the very near future. Goodbye, everyone.